The Way to Zeray, Chapter 42 of Shardik by Richard Adams. Where the track was leading he did not know, or even whether it still ran eastward, for now the trees were thick, and they followed it in a half-light under a close roof of branches. Several times he was tempted to leave altogether the faint thread of a path, and simply go downhill, find a stream, and follow it, an old hunter's trick, which, as he knew, often leads to a dwelling or a village, though it may be with difficulty. But the Tuginda, he saw, would not be equal to such a course. Since resuming their journey she had spoken little, and walked, or so it seemed to him, like one going where she would not. Never before had she appeared to him subdued in spirit. He recalled how, even on the Gelt road, she had stepped firmly and deliberately away down the hillside, as though undaunted by her shameful arrest at the hands of Tarqueminian. She had trusted God then, he thought. She had known that God could afford to wait, and therefore so could she. Even before he himself had caged Shardik at the cost of Ransay's life, the Tuginda had known that the time would come when she would be called once more to follow the power of God. She had recognized, when it came, the day of Shardik's liberation from the imprisonment to which he himself had subjected him. What she had not foreseen was Urta, the destination ordained for the bloody beast god of the Urtelgans, in whose name his followers had. Unable to bear these thoughts, he flung up his head, striking one hand against his brow, and slashing at the bushes with his stick. The Tuginda seemed not to notice his sudden violence, but walked slowly on as before, her eyes on the ground. "In Bekla," he said, breaking their silence, "I felt many times that I was close to a great secret to be revealed through Lord Shardik, a secret which would show men at last the meaning of their lives on earth, how to safeguard the future, how to be secure. We would no longer be blind and ignorant, but God's servants, knowing how he meant us to live. Yet, though I suffered much, both waking and sleeping, I never learned that secret." "The door was locked," she answered listlessly. "It was I who locked it," he said, and so fell silent once more. Late in the afternoon, emerging at last from the woods, they came to a miserable hamlet of 3 or 4 huts beside a stream. 2 men who could not understand him, but muttered to each other in a tongue he had never heard, searched him from head to foot, but found nothing to steal. They would have handled and searched the Tuginda also, had he not seized one by the wrist and flung him aside. Evidently they thought that whatever chance of gain there might be was not worth a fight, for they stood back, cursing, or so it seemed, and gesturing to him to be off. Before the Tuginda and he had gone a stone's throw, however, a gaunt, ragged woman came running after them, held out a morsel of hard bread, and, smiling with blackened teeth, pointed back towards the huts. The Tuginda returned her smile, accepting the invitation with no sign of fear, and he, feeling that it mattered little what might befall him, made no objection. The woman, scolding shrilly at the 2 men standing a little distance off, seated her guests on a bench outside one of the huts, and brought them bowls of thin soup, containing a kind of tasteless grey root that crumbled to fibrous shreds in the mouth. 2 other women gathered, and 3 or 4 rickety, pot-bellied children, who stared silently and seemed to lack the energy to shout or scuffle. The Tuginda thanked the woman gravely in Urtelgan, kissing their filthy hands and smiling at each in turn. Keldrak sat, as he had sat the night before, lost in his thoughts, and only half aware that the children had begun to teach her some game with stones in the dust. Once or twice she laughed, and the children laughed too, and by one of the surly men came and offered him a clay bowl full of weak, sour wine, first drinking himself to show that there was no harm. Keldrak drank, gravely pledging his host, then watched the moon rise, and later, invited into one of the huts, once more lay down to sleep upon the ground. Waking in the night, he went out and saw another man sitting cross-legged beside a low fire. For a time he sat beside him without speaking, but at length, as the man bent forward to thrust one end of a fresh branch into the glow, he pointed towards the nearby stream and said, "Zeray?" The man nodded, and pointing to him, repeated, "Zeray?" And when he nodded in his turn, laughed shortly, and mimicked one in flight, looking behind him for pursuers. Keldrak shrugged his shoulders, and they said no more, each sitting by the fire until daybreak. There was no path beside the stream, and the Tuginda and he followed its course with difficulty through another tract of forest, from which it came out to plunge in a series of falls down a rocky hillside. Standing on the brow, he looked out over the plain below. Some miles away on their left, the mountains still ran eastward. Following the chain with his eye, he glimpsed, far off in the east, a thin silver streak, dull and constant in the sunlight. He pointed to it. "That must be the Teltherna, Sayet." She nodded, and after a few moments he said, "I doubt whether Lord Shardik will ever reach it, and if we cannot trace him when we get there, I suppose we shall never know what became of him." "Either you or I," she answered, "will find Lord Shardik again. I saw it in a dream." After gazing intently for a little towards the southeast, she began to lead the way downhill among the tumbled boulders. "What did you see, Sayet?" he asked, when next they rested. "I was looking for some trace of Zeray," she replied, "but of course there is nothing to be seen from so far." And he, acquiescing in the misunderstanding, whether deliberate on her part or otherwise, questioned her no further of Shardik. From the foot of the hillside there stretched a wide marsh that mired them to the knees as they continued to follow the stream among pools and reed clumps. Keldrek began to entertain a kind of fancy that he, like one in an old tale, was bewitched, and changing, not swiftly, but day by day, from a man to an animal. The change had begun at the Vraco, and continued imperceptibly until now, when he wandered, like a beast in a field, pent within land not of his own choosing, and where neither places nor people had names. The power of speech was gradually leaving him too, so that already he was able, through long waking hours, not only to be silent, but also actually to think nothing. His human awareness retracted to the smallest of points, like the pupil of a cat's eye in sunlight, while his life, continued by the sufferance of others, had become a meaningless span of existence before death. And more immediate to him now than any human regret or shame were simply the sores and other painful places beneath the sweat-stiffened hide of his clothes. Crossing the marsh after some hours, they came at last upon a track, and then to a village, the only one he had seen east of the Vraco, and the poorest and most wretched he could remember. They were resting a short distance outside it, when a man carrying a faggot of brushwood passed them, and Keldrek, leaving the Tuginda sitting beside the track, overtook him, and asked once more the way to Zeray. The man pointed southeastward, answering in Becklin. "About half a day's journey. You'll not get there before dark." Then, in a lower tone, and glancing across at the Tuginda, he added, "Poor old woman, the likes of her to be going to Zeray." Keldrek must have glanced sharply at him, for he added quickly, "No business of mine. She don't look well, that's all. Touch of fever, maybe." And at once went on his way with his burden, as though afraid that he might already have said too much in this country where the past was sharp splinters embedded in men's minds, and an ill-judged word a false step in the dark. They had hardly reached the first huts, the Tuginda leaning heavily upon Keldrek's arm, when a man barred their way. He was dirty and unsmiling, with blue tattoo marks on his cheeks, and the lobe of one ear pierced by a bone pin as long as a finger. He resembled none that Keldrek could remember to have seen among the multiracial trading throngs of Bekla. Yet when he spoke it was in a thick, distorted Becklin, one word making do for another. "You walk from?" Keldrek pointed northwestward, where the sun was beginning to set. "High places, trees, all through you walk?" "Yes, from beyond the Vraco. We're going to Zeray. Let me save you trouble," said Keldrek. "We've nothing worth taking, and this woman, as you can see, is no longer young. She's exhausted." "Sick. High places, trees, much sick. Not sit down here. Go away." "She's not sick, only tired. I beg you." "Not sit down," shouted the man fiercely. "Go away." The Tuginda was about to speak to him when suddenly he turned his head and uttered a sharp cry, at which other men began to appear from among the huts. The tattooed man shouted, "Woman sick!" in Becklin, and then broke into some other language, at which they nodded, responding, "Aye, aye!" After a few moments the Tuginda, relinquishing Keldrek's arm, turned and began walking slowly back up the track. He followed. As he reached her side, a stone struck her on the shoulder, so that she staggered and fell against him. A second stone pitched into the dust at their feet, and the next struck him on the heel. Shouting had broken out behind them. Without looking round, he bowed his head against the falling stones, put his arm round the Tuginda's shoulders, and half dragged, half carried her back in the direction from which they had come. Helping her to a patch of grass, he sat down beside her. She was trembling, her breath coming in gasps, but after a few moments she opened her eyes and half rose to her feet, looking back down the road. "Bless the bastards," whispered the Tuginda. Then, meeting his stare, she laughed. "Didn't you know, Keldrek, that there are times when everyone swears? And I had brothers once, long ago." She put her hand over her eyes and swayed a moment. "That brute was right, though. I'm not well." "You've eaten nothing all day, Sayet. Never mind. If we can find somewhere to lie down and sleep, we shall reach Zeray tomorrow, and there I believe we may find help." Wandering over the ground near by, he came upon a stack of turves, and of these made a kind of shelter in which they huddled side by side for warmth. The Tuginda was restless and feverish, talking in her sleep of Ransay and Sheldra, and of autumn leaves to be swept from the ledges. Keldrek lay awake, tormented by hunger and the pain in his heel. Soon now, he thought, the change would be complete, and as an animal he would suffer less. The stars moved on, and at length, watching them, he also fell asleep. Soon after dawn, for fear of the villagers, he roused the Tuginda, and led her away through a ground mist as white and chill as that through which Eleroth had been brought to execution. To see her reduced to infirmity, catching her breath as she leaned upon him, and compelled to rest after every stone's throw, walked at the pace of a blind beggar, not only wrung his heart, but filled him also with misgiving, the misgiving of one who observes some portent in the sky, and fears its boding. The Tuginda, like any other woman of flesh and blood, was not equal to the hardship and danger of this land. Like any other woman, she could sicken and perhaps die. Contemplating this possibility, he realized that always, even in Bekla, he had unconsciously felt her to be standing, compassionate and impervious, between himself and the consuming truth of God. He, the impostor, had stolen from her everything of Shardik, his bodily presence, his ceremony, the power and adulation, all that was of men, everything but the invisible burden of responsibility borne by Shardik's rightful mediator, the inward knowledge that if she failed there was none other. She it was, and not he, who for more than 5 years had borne a spiritual load, made doubly heavy by his own abuse of Shardik. If now she were to die, so that none remained between him and the truth of God, then he, lacking the necessary wisdom and humility, would not be fit to step into her place. He was found out in his pretensions, and the last action of the fraudulent priest-king should be not to seek death from Shardik, of which he was unworthy, but rather to creep, like a cockroach from the light, into some crevice of this country of perdition, there to await whatever death might befall him from sickness or violence. Meanwhile, the fate of Shardik would remain unknown. He would vanish unwatched and unattended, like a great rock dislodged from a mountainside that smashes its way downward, coming to rest at last in the trackless forests far below. Afterwards, of all that took place during that day, he could recall only one incident. A few miles beyond the village they came upon a group of men and women working in a field. A little distance away from the others 2 girls were resting. One had a baby at the breast, and both, as they laughed and talked, were eating from a wicker basket. Half a mile further on he persuaded the Tuginda to lie down and rest, told her he would return soon, and hastened back to the field. Approaching unseen, he crept close to the 2 girls, sprang suddenly upon them, snatched their basket, and ran. They screamed, but, as he had calculated, their friends were slow to reach them, and there was no pursuit. He was out of sight, had wolfed half the food, thrown away the basket, and rejoined the Tuginda almost before they had decided that a silly girl's few handfuls of bread and dried fruit were not worth the loss of an hour's work. As he limped away on his bruised heel, coaxing the Tuginda to swallow the crusts and raisins he had brought back, he reflected that starvation and misery made an apt pupil. Ruvit himself could hardly have done better, unless, indeed, he had silenced the girls with his knife. Evening was falling once more when he realized that they must at last be approaching Zeray. They had seen few people all day, and none had spoken to or molested them, due no doubt partly to their destitution, which showed them clearly enough to be not worth robbing, and partly to the evident sickness of the Tuginda. There had been no more woodland, and Kelderek had simply gone southeast by the sun through an open wilderness, broken here and there by sorry pastures and small patches of ploughed land. Finally they had come once more to reeds and sedges, and so to the shore of a creek, which he guessed to be an inlet of the Telferna itself. They followed it a little way inland, rounded the head, and so came to the southern bank, along which they made their way. As it grew broader, he could see, beyond the creek's mouth, the Telferna itself, narrower here than at Ortelga, and running very strongly, the eastern shore rocky in the distance across the water. Even through his despair, a kind of dull, involuntary echo of pleasure stole upon him, a subdued lightening of the spirit, faint as a nimbus of the moon behind white clouds. That water had flowed past Ortelga's reeds, had rippled over Ortelga's broken causeway. He tried to point it out to the Tuginda, but she only shook her head wearily, scarcely able to follow even the direction of his arm. If she were to die in Zeray, he thought, his last duty would be to ensure that somehow the news was carried upstream to Kiso. Despite what she had said, there seemed little hope of their finding help in a remote, squalid settlement, peopled almost entirely, or so he had always understood, by fugitives from the justice of half a dozen lands. He could see the outskirts now, much like those of Ortelga, huts and wood smoke, circling birds, and, in the evening air, from which the sunlight was beginning to fade, the glitter of the Telferna. "Where are we, Kelderek?" whispered the Tuginda. Almost her whole weight was upon his arm, and she was grey-faced and sweating. He helped her to drink from a clear pool, and then supported her to a little grassy mound near by. "This is Zeray, Sayet, I suppose?" "But here, this place." He looked about him. They were in what seemed a kind of wild, untended garden, where spring flowers were growing and trees stood in bloom. A melican hung over the water, and peasants' false lasses, covered with the blossoms which would later turn to golden berries dropping in the still summer air. Everywhere were low banks and mounds like the one on which they were sitting, and now he saw that several of these had been roughly marked with stones or pieces of wood stuck in the ground. Some looked new, others old and dilapidated. At a little distance were 4 or 5 mounds of newly turned earth, ungrassed and strewn with a few flowers and black beads. "This is a graveyard, Sayet. It must be the burial ground of Zeray." She nodded. "Sometimes in these places they have a watchman to keep off animals at night. He might—" She broke off, coughing, but then resumed with an effort. "He might tell us something of Zeray." "Rest here, Sayet. I will go and see." He set off among the graves, and had not gone far when he saw, at a little distance, the figure of a woman, standing in prayer. Her back was towards him, and both she and the raised grave pile beside which she was standing were outlined against the sky. The sides of the grave had been faced with boards, carved and painted, giving it something of the appearance of a large decorated chest, and by contrast with the neglected humps all around, it possessed a kind of grandeur. At one end a pennant had been thrust upright in the soil, but the cloth hung limp, unstirred by the least wind, and he could not see the device. The woman, dressed in black and bareheaded like a mourner, appeared to be young. He wondered whether the grave to which she had come alone was that of her husband, and whether he had died a natural or a violent death. Slim and graceful against the pale sky, her arms extended and hands raised palm forward, she was standing motionless, as though for her the beauty and dignity of this traditional posture constituted in themselves a prayer as devout as any words or thoughts that could proceed from her mind. This, he thought, is a woman to whom it is natural to express her feelings, even grief, through her body as well as through her lips. If Zeray contains even one woman of such grace, perhaps it cannot be altogether vile. He was about to go up to her when the sudden thought of how he must appear made him hesitate and turn away. Since leaving Bekla he had not seen his own reflection, but he remembered Ruvit, like some shambling red-eyed animal, and the ragged, stinking men who had first searched and then befriended him. Why this woman was here alone he could not tell. Perhaps young women in Zeray commonly went out alone, though from all that he had ever heard of the place this seemed unlikely. Could she perhaps be some courtesan mourning a favourite lover? Whatever the reason, the sight of himself would probably alarm her, and might even put her to flight. But she would feel no fear of the Tuginda, and might even take pity on her. He retraced his steps to the water. "Sayet, there is a woman praying not far away, a young woman. For me to approach her alone would only frighten her. If I help you and we go slowly, can you come with me?" She nodded, licking her dry lips, and stretching out both her hands for his. Helping her to his feet, he supported her faltering steps among the graves. The young woman was still standing motionless, her arms raised, as though to draw down peace and blessing upon the dead friend or lover earth-wrapped at her feet. The posture, as well he knew, became a strained one in no long while, yet she seemed heedless of discomfort, of tormenting flies, and the loneliness of the place, absorbed in her self-contained, silent sorrow. She needs neither to weep nor to utter words, he thought. Perhaps loss and regret fill her life as they have come to fill mine, and she can add nothing except her presence in this place. No doubt there are many such in Zeray. As they approached the tomb, the Tuginda coughed again, and the woman, startled, turned quickly round. The face was young, and though still beautiful, thin with hardship, and marred, as he had guessed, by the lines of a settled sorrow. Seeing her eyes widen with surprise and fear, he whispered urgently, "Speak, Sayet, or she will fly." The woman was staring as though at a ghost. The knuckles of her clenched hands were pressed to her open mouth, and suddenly, through her rapid breathing, came a low cry. Yet she neither ran nor turned to run, only staring on in incredulous amazement. He, too, stood still, afraid to move, and trying to recall of what her consternation reminded him. Then, even as he saw her tears begin to flow, she sank to her knees, still gazing fixedly at the Tuginda, with a look like that of a child unexpectedly found by a searching mother, and as yet uncertain whether that mother will show herself loving or angry. Suddenly, in a passion of weeping, she flung herself to the ground, grasping the Tuginda's ankles and kissing her feet in the grass. "Sayet," she cried through her tears, "oh, forgive me, only forgive me, Sayet, and I will die at peace." Lifting her head, she looked up at them, her face agonized and distorted with crying. Yet now Kelderek recognized her, and knew also where he had seen before that very look of fear. For it was Melithus who lay prostrate before them, clasping the Tuginda's feet. A quick gust of wind from the river ran through the trees and was gone, tossing and opening the pennant as some passer-by might idly have spread it with his hand and let it fall again. For a moment the emblem, a golden snake, showed plainly, rippling as though alive, and then drooped and disappeared once more among the folds of the dark pendant cloth.